The medallion hit the ground with a metallic clink, unveiling a secret that had been hidden for 2 decades. Thomas Armstrong, one of the most powerful men in the country, picked up the delicate gold piece, feeling the weight of a truth that would change his life forever. On the back of the medallion, an inscription worn down by time made his heart stop. "For my twin sister Catherine, with eternal love, Elizabeth." Elizabeth, the name of his late wife. But this moment of revelation was yet to come. To understand how Thomas arrived at this point, we need to go back 3 months, when the Armstrong mansion was still nothing more than a monument to wealth and solitude. On a particularly cold autumn morning, Thomas stood gazing at his empire of glass and marble with the satisfaction of a man who had built every inch of it through relentless determination. The 3-story mansion, with its imposing columns and meticulously maintained gardens, was just another symbol of his success. A success that, by age 45, had turned him into one of the most respected and feared CEOs in the tech industry. His reflection in the office window revealed a man with sharp features, prematurely graying hair, and piercing blue eyes that rarely betrayed any emotion. His custom-tailored $5,000 Italian suit fit him like a second skin, as did the mask of coldness he had perfected over the years. He checked his Rolex. Another important meeting in 15 minutes. Time, to Thomas Armstrong, was just another commodity to be traded. Down in the vast garden, his son Michael played alone. At 7 years old, the boy was a living reflection of Elizabeth, with the same golden hair and expressive eyes that had once made Thomas fall in love. Since the accident that had taken Elizabeth 3 years ago, Michael had grown increasingly quiet, as though he bore a burden far too heavy for his small shoulders. Thomas watched as Mary Bennett crossed the garden toward his son. The housekeeper had a presence unlike the other staff who had worked in the mansion. At 45, Mary wasn't a woman who drew immediate attention. Her brown hair was always tied in a simple bun, her clothing unassuming and her movements calm. Yet there was something about her, a quiet dignity Thomas had never been able to fully decipher. "Look what I brought for you, Michael." Mary's gentle voice floated up to the office as she pulled something from her apron, a small paper airplane folded with precision. The boy's face lit up instantly in a way Thomas rarely saw. "Will you teach me how to make one like that, Mary?" Michael asked, his voice filled with a rare excitement that seemed reserved just for her. "Of course, sweetheart. Come on, let's sit here and I'll show you every fold." Thomas felt that familiar pang of jealousy as he watched his son run to hug Mary. It was the kind of spontaneous affection Michael never showed him. Over the past 2 years since Mary had started working at the mansion, she had become more than just a housekeeper. She was a safe harbor for Michael, a constant presence filling voids that Thomas didn't know how to bridge. The CEO tried to refocus on the documents spread across his desk, but something about the scene below unsettled him. There was a natural ease in the way Mary interacted with Michael that went beyond professionalism. It was as if she instinctively understood what the boy needed, as though she could read his emotions in a way Thomas, his own father, couldn't. When Thomas went downstairs to retrieve some forgotten documents from the living room, a conversation between Michael and Mary caught his attention. They were sitting on the Italian leather sofa, and Michael was holding a framed photo, the last family picture they had taken with Elizabeth. "Mary, do you think Mom would be proud of me?" Michael's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas froze on the staircase, hidden by the shadow of the hallway. Mary's response made his heart tighten in an inexplicable way. "Your mom is proud of you every single day, sweetheart. I know that because..." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her apron. "Because mothers always know. And your mom, Elizabeth, had a special way of loving, didn't she?" Thomas watched, intrigued, as Mary unconsciously touched something around her neck, a golden medallion usually hidden beneath her blouse. There was a troubling familiarity in that gesture, something that stirred a distant memory within him. "Mary," Michael continued, his voice filled with childlike curiosity, "how do you know so much about my mom?" The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. Thomas noticed Mary pale slightly, her fingers tightening around the medallion. I just imagined, sweetheart. All mothers are alike in some ways." But there was something in her voice, a note of restrained emotion Thomas had never noticed before. It was as if each word carried a weight greater than it appeared, as though behind that simple answer lay a far more complex story. That night in his office, Thomas couldn't focus on the contracts he needed to review. His mind kept drifting back to that moment, to the way Mary spoke about Elizabeth, to the medallion she wore. Details began to connect in his mind, small gestures, expressions, the way Mary sometimes looked at Michael with a mixture of love and pain that seemed far too deep for a mere employee. Opening a drawer in his desk, Thomas pulled out an old photo album he hadn't touched in years. The last pictures of Elizabeth were there, frozen in time. Then something caught his eye. In one of the final photos, Elizabeth was wearing a medallion identical to the one he had seen around Mary's neck. The CEO felt his world start to tilt. Memories of old conversations with Elizabeth began to surface. Fragments of stories about a sister he had never met, about family secrets his wife preferred not to discuss. Thomas had always respected her silence, but now, staring at that photo, a troubling possibility began to take shape in his mind. Who was Mary Bennet truly? And why did she possess a medallion identical to Elizabeth's? The answers to these questions were about to shake the carefully constructed foundation of Thomas Armstrong's world, forcing him to question not only his certainties but also his most fundamental values. The discovery of the medallion ignited a quiet obsession within Thomas. In the days that followed, he began to observe Mary with a new intensity, mentally cataloging every gesture, every word, every interaction with Michael. Work, which had always been his top priority, now shared space with a personal investigation that consumed his thoughts. One particularly hectic morning, Thomas did the unthinkable. He canceled 3 critical meetings. His assistant, James, called twice to confirm there wasn't some mistake. So unusual was this deviation from his meticulously planned routine. Sitting in his office, Thomas sifted through Elizabeth's old documents, desperate to uncover any clues about her family history. It was maddening to realize how little he knew about the past of the woman he had loved. The boxes scattered across the floor revealed fragments of Elizabeth's life: diplomas, old letters, faded photographs. One photo stood out: Elizabeth, smiling in front of an old building Thomas recognized as the orphanage where she had grown up. There was a sorrow in her eyes he had never noticed before, as if the image concealed a story too painful to share. "Mr. Armstrong?" His secretary's voice broke through the intercom, pulling him back to the present. "You have a video call with the investors in 5 minutes? They're particularly eager to discuss the merger with the Asian firm." "Cancel it," he replied curtly, his eyes locked on an old birth certificate he'd found among the documents. Something about it caught his attention. There was a nearly illegible notation in the margin, mentioning a twin birth. The paper was yellowed and some parts were smudged, but that small note felt like a beacon in the dark. The sound of laughter drifting in from the garden caught his attention. Mary was helping Michael with his science homework, something about the solar system. She had turned the study session into a sort of game, using oranges and apples to represent the planets. The boy, usually so reserved, was laughing openly as Mary made an orange orbit around a larger apple. "Look, Michael," Mary's voice floated gently into the office. "Jupiter is much bigger than Earth. That's why we're using this big orange to represent it." Thomas watched as she explained each concept with endless patience, breaking down complex ideas into something a 7-year-old could grasp. It was the kind of thing Elizabeth used to do, turning learning into an adventure. His gaze fell on an old photo of Elizabeth teaching Michael, then only 3 years old, how to assemble a puzzle. The same kind smile, the same tilt of the head, the same gentle touch on the child's shoulder to draw his attention. The similarities between Elizabeth and Mary were more than coincidence. They felt like echoes of the same soul. Thomas picked up his phone and, on an impulse, dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Margaret? This is Thomas Armstrong. I need some information about the orphanage where Elizabeth grew up." Margaret Thompson had been the social worker who handled Michael's adoption. A woman in her 60s, she had devoted her life to helping abandoned children. Thomas knew she also had connections to the orphanage where Elizabeth had spent part of her childhood. "Thomas? What a surprise. It's been such a long time. The last time we spoke was during Michael's adoption. How is he?" "He's doing well, Margaret. But I need your help with something different now. I need to know everything about Elizabeth's history at that place. Especially..." He hesitated for a moment. If she had a sister. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Thomas could hear Margaret's heavy breathing, as if she were bearing the weight of something significant. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was tinged with caution. "Thomas, some secrets from the past are better left in the past. Elizabeth had her reasons for keeping certain things quiet. Not this time, Margaret. I need to know the truth. If what I suspect is true, well, it changes everything." After a few seconds of hesitation, Margaret sighed. "Meet me at the cafe in the old bookstore downtown, tomorrow at 10 a.m. And Thomas, come prepared. Some truths aren't easy to hear." Elizabeth left specific instructions about certain details. The mention of instructions left by Elizabeth made Thomas's heart leap. "What kind of instructions?" "Tomorrow, Thomas. Some things need to be said in person. As he hung up the phone, Thomas noticed Mary coming into the house with Michael. She wore a serene expression, but there was something in her eyes, a shadow of melancholy that seemed more pronounced when she looked at the boy. It was the same look Elizabeth used to have when she talked about her childhood at the orphanage. "Mary," Thomas called, descending the stairs. It was the first time in weeks he had initiated a direct conversation with her. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Mary paused, her hands instinctively adjusting her apron, a nervous habit Thomas had started to notice. The medallion around her neck caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, glinting briefly. "Of course, Mr. Armstrong," she replied softly. "Michael has been different lately. Happier." The words came hesitantly, as if Thomas were admitting a personal defeat. "You seem to know exactly how to handle him." A gentle smile crossed Mary's face, and for a moment, Thomas saw Elizabeth in that smile. "Sometimes, Mr. Armstrong, all a child needs is someone who truly listens. Michael is an extraordinary boy, much like—" She stopped abruptly, as if she had been about to reveal something she shouldn't. "Like who, Mary?" "Like his mother," she quickly replied, but Thomas noticed the slight tremor in her voice. "If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare lunch." As he watched her hurry off toward the kitchen, Thomas felt that all too familiar sensation, that there was something bigger happening right under his nose. The way Mary had said his mother carried a particular weight, as if each word had been carefully chosen to conceal a larger truth. That night, after putting Michael to bed, something he hadn't done in months, Thomas went to his office and turned on his computer. He began searching through old records from the orphanage where Elizabeth had grown up. Most of the files had been digitized, but many critical documents seemed to be missing or deliberately removed. One photo in particular caught his attention, a faded image of a group of children from the orphanage dated 30 years ago. In the front row, two identical girls smiled at the camera, each wearing a gold medallion. The caption was partially erased, but Thomas could make out the names: Elizabeth and Catherine. His heart raced. Catherine, the same name engraved on the medallion. The resemblance between the girls in the photo and Mary was undeniable, even with the age difference. But if Mary was indeed Catherine, Elizabeth's twin sister, why was she working as a housekeeper in his home? And why had she never revealed herself? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Michael, standing in the doorway in his Avengers pajamas, hugging a stuffed bear that Elizabeth had given him on his last birthday. "Dad? I can't sleep." Thomas quickly shut the computer window. "What's wrong, son?" "Mary always tells me a story when I can't sleep. But today she seems sad. I think she was crying in the kitchen earlier. She was holding an old photo and crying while looking at it." Michael's words hit Thomas like a punch. The thought of Mary, or was it Catherine, crying alone in his kitchen, holding on to such a huge secret, made something inside him twist. How many nights had she spent like that, so close yet so far from revealing her true identity? "Come here," Thomas said, pulling his son onto his lap, a gesture he hadn't made in a long time. The familiar weight of Michael in his arms brought a wave of memories of Elizabeth. "How about I tell you a story tonight? Can you tell stories, Dad?" Michael's innocent question carried a painful truth. Thomas had distanced himself so much from his son that even a simple bedtime story seemed like a monumental task. "I'll try," he replied, settling Michael on his lap. Once upon a time, there were two sisters who were so alike that no one could tell them apart. As he wove a story about family bonds and hidden secrets, Thomas's mind wandered to his meeting with Margaret the next day. Something told him that the answers he sought would change not just his life, but Michael's as well. And most importantly, the truth about who Mary Bennet really was. The mystery of the medallion was just beginning to unfold, and Thomas Armstrong, the man who had always controlled everything, was about to discover that some secrets had the power to completely reshape the contours of our existence. The old bookstore in the city center was one of those places that seemed to exist in a time of its own. The scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Thomas waited for Margaret at a secluded table. His fingers nervously drummed on the untouched coffee cup, his Rolex ticking away each passing minute like a countdown to a revelation that could change everything. The establishment, with its dark wooden shelves reaching all the way to the ceiling and wrought iron spiral staircases, seemed like the perfect setting for important revelations. Thomas had chosen a table in the most discreet corner, partially hidden behind a shelf of rare books. Through the old window, he could see the movement of the street, people rushing by, living their normal lives, unaware of the drama that was about to unfold. Margaret Thompson arrived promptly at 10 a.m., carrying a worn leather folder and a grave expression that made Thomas's stomach twist. At 65, she still held that air of serene authority that had always characterized her, her gray hair neatly styled, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of thousands of untold stories. "Before we begin," Margaret said, sitting down and politely declining the offer of coffee, "I need you to understand something, Thomas. What I'm about to tell you today, Elizabeth planned every detail. Every decision, every secret kept was out of love, for both you and Michael." Thomas felt his throat tighten. Why didn't she ever tell me about her sister? Margaret opened the folder with a care that bordered on reverence. The worn leather had marks from years of use, and Thomas could see several meticulously organized dividers inside. She pulled out a yellowed envelope that looked like it had been handled many times. "This letter was left by Elizabeth to be delivered to you if certain circumstances arose. Given what you've told me about Mary, I think the time has come." With trembling hands, Thomas opened the envelope. The paper carried that distinctive scent of something kept for a long time, and Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, so familiar yet painfully distant, covered several pages. "My beloved Thomas, if you're reading this letter, it means that somehow you've discovered about Catherine. My twin sister, my best friend, my other half. Our story is complex and painful, but you deserve to know the truth. Catherine and I grew up together in the orphanage, inseparable. The medallions we wore were our only connection to our biological parents. A gift left with us when we were abandoned as babies. We promised never to separate, but fate had other plans. At 16 I was adopted by a wealthy family. They only wanted one daughter, not two. The pain of the separation almost destroyed us. Catherine was left behind, and I promised that one day I would return to get her. But life, as always, is more complicated than our teenage plans." Thomas stopped reading, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold the paper. The coffee in front of him had grown cold, forgotten. "Margaret, you knew about this the whole time?" "Yes," she replied softly. "I was the social worker assigned to their case. I witnessed the moment of their separation. It was one of the hardest things I've ever witnessed in my career. The girls clung to each other, crying and promising that nothing would ever tear them apart. Catherine had to be restrained when they took Elizabeth away. The mental image of that scene caused Thomas a physical ache in his chest. He returned to the letter, his mind struggling to process each new revelation. Catherine tried to kill herself after I left. Guilt consumed me for years. When we reunited as adults, she had changed her name to Mary and worked as a housemaid. She refused to accept my financial help, saying she needed to build her own life. When I found out I was sick, I made Catherine promise she would take care of Michael if anything happened to me. She hesitated, but I knew no one could love our son like she could. I arranged for her to be hired as a maid in our home, knowing that you, with your busy schedule, would hardly notice the similarities between us. Thomas, I know you must be furious that I kept this secret. But Catherine carries deep scars from our past. She needed to approach Michael on her own terms, without the weight of expectations or family obligations." Thomas lifted his eyes from the letter, meeting Margaret's compassionate gaze. The light streaming through the window cast soft shadows on her aging face, highlighting years of experience and wisdom. Why did she keep up this charade after Elizabeth died? Why didn't she tell me the truth? Margaret sighed deeply, adjusting herself in the old wooden chair. Catherine, or Mary as she prefers to be called now, spent her whole life losing people she loved. First our parents, then Elizabeth. The fear of losing her connection to Michael, if you found out the truth, paralyzed her. But she's his aunt. She has every right. It's not always about rights, Thomas, Margaret gently interrupted. Sometimes it's about protection. Mary witnessed how you shut down after Elizabeth's death. She feared that you would push Michael away from her if you knew the truth, that you'd see her as an intruder trying to take Elizabeth's place. Thomas felt a wave of shame wash over him as he recognized that this fear wasn't entirely unfounded. His behavior over the past few years had hardly inspired trust. How many times had he ignored Michael, lost in his own grief and work? He continued reading the letter, Elizabeth's words feeling even heavier now. "There's one more thing you need to know, Thomas. The night of the accident, I was on my way to meet Catherine. She had finally agreed to reveal her identity to you. Fate once again had other plans. Please don't judge my sister harshly. Every day she spent in our home taking care of Michael was an act of pure love, both for him and for my memory. Catherine deserves the chance to be who she truly is, to love Michael openly as his aunt. With eternal love, Elizabeth." Thomas carefully folded the letter, feeling the weight of every word. The paper seemed to burn in his hands, heavy with truths that had been hidden for so long. How did I never see it? The similarities, the way she was with Michael. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, Margaret commented softly, especially when we're too busy protecting our own hearts from pain. At that moment Thomas's phone buzzed. It was a message from Mary. "Mr. Armstrong, Michael has a high fever. I'm taking him to the hospital." Thomas felt his heart freeze. He stood up abruptly, knocking his coffee cup over. The dark liquid spilled across the table, staining the edge of the letter. "I need to go, Michael." "Go," Margaret said, understanding immediately. "But Thomas, think carefully about what you're going to do with this information. Some truths need to be revealed at the right time in the right way." The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and streets. Thomas drove with an urgency he hadn't felt in years, his mind torn between worry for Michael and the revelations about Mary, not Catherine. When he arrived at the emergency room, he found her in the waiting area, nervously wringing her hands. "Where is he?" Thomas asked, breathless. "The doctor is with him now," Mary answered, her voice trembling slightly. The fever came on suddenly and he was delirious, calling for his mother. Thomas observed her more closely now, finally seeing what had been right before him all this time. The same face shape as Elizabeth, the same way she tilted her head when worried, even the tone of her voice was similar. How could he have been so blind? "Mr. Armstrong?" A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Your son is asking for you. And for Aunt Mary." Mary froze at those words, her face visibly paling. Her eyes met Thomas's, full of fear and silent pleading. The moment of truth had come sooner than either of them had expected. And now, standing in that sterile, impersonal hospital room, Thomas had to decide how to deal with a truth that had the power to either rebuild or completely destroy the fragile bonds of his family. The hospital room was immersed in the characteristic quiet of pediatric units at night. Michael was asleep now, the fever finally under control after hours of anxiety. The heart monitor emitted its rhythmic beeps, like a metronome marking time in a silent melody of waiting and reflection. Thomas watched his son from the chair next to the bed, while Mary, not Catherine, he needed to get used to this truth, gently adjusted the blankets around the boy. Her movements were so natural, so maternal, that they made Thomas's heart ache with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "The fever's gone completely," Mary whispered, checking Michael's forehead once again with the back of her hand. "The doctor said it was just a strong virus, but we need to keep him under observation tonight." Thomas nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene before him. In his sleep, Michael had instinctively clung to Mary's hand, just like he used to with Elizabeth. The similarity was so painful that Thomas had to look away. "Catherine," he whispered, the words slipping out like a heavy sigh. Mary froze, her hand still resting on Michael's forehead. The name she hadn't heard in so long dropped between them like a silent bomb, irrevocably changing the air in the room. Slowly she turned to face him, her wide eyes filled with fear and surprise. "How?" her voice faltered. "Margaret gave me Elizabeth's letter today," Thomas replied, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Michael. "The letter she left explaining everything about the two of you." Mary, Catherine, staggered slightly, needing to steady herself on the edge of the hospital bed. Her hands trembled visibly as she reached for the pendant around her neck, a gesture that Thomas now recognized as her anchor in moments of anxiety. "I'm so sorry," she began, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I never wanted to deceive you, but Elizabeth insisted it was the best way. And after the accident, I didn't know how." "Why didn't you tell me after she died?" Thomas interrupted, a twinge of anger in his voice that he struggled to control. "Why keep this lie for so long?" Catherine took a deep breath, looking at Michael before answering. "You shut yourself off completely after she died, Thomas. You buried yourself in work, barely even looked at Michael. I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd push me away from him. And he'd already lost so much." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. It was true, after Elizabeth's death, he had become a shadow of himself, burying himself in work to escape the pain. Michael, so small and vulnerable, had been left to drift in his own grief. "The pendant," Thomas said softly, nodding toward the jewelry around Catherine's neck. "It was the first thing that made me suspect. Elizabeth had an identical one." Catherine touched the pendant again, a small, sad smile appearing on her lips. "Our only inheritance. Our biological mother left them with us at the orphanage, along with a note saying she would come back one day. She never did." The silence that followed was only filled by the constant beep of the monitor and Michael's soft breathing. Thomas watched as Catherine unconsciously adjusted the boy's hair, just as Elizabeth used to do. Did Elizabeth know she was sick? Thomas asked suddenly, an old suspicion finally taking shape. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, as if the question had physically wounded her. Yes, she replied after a long pause. She found out about the cancer 6 months before the accident. The doctors said it was aggressive, that she didn't have much time. Why didn't she tell me? Thomas's voice was heavy with pain and disbelief. She didn't want her last months to be about her illness. She wanted you and Michael to have memories of her alive, happy. Catherine hesitated before continuing. That's why she asked me to come work here. She wanted to make sure Michael would have someone to love him like she did when... Her voice faltered, and the tears she had been holding back finally began to fall. Thomas felt his own vision blur. The night of the accident, Catherine continued, her voice barely a whisper, she was coming to meet me. We had decided to tell you everything. She didn't want to leave with that secret. Thomas stood up abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the turbulent energy these revelations stirred within him. He walked to the hospital window, gazing at the city lights below. The reflection in the glass showed Catherine still by the bed, her hand gently brushing Michael's hair. All these years, he finally said, you've been here taking care of him, loving him, while I could barely look at my own son because he reminded me too much of her. Thomas? No, he interrupted, turning to face her. I need to say this. I failed him. I failed Elizabeth. While I drowned in self-pity and work, you were here, being the family he needed. Catherine took a hesitant step toward him. You didn't fail. You were suffering too. Elizabeth knew how much you loved her, how much you loved Michael. That's why she planned all of this, to give both of you time to heal. A soft groan from the bed interrupted the conversation. Michael was stirring, his eyes slowly opening. Dad? He called, his voice still hoarse with sleep. Aunt Mary? The word aunt made Catherine freeze again, her eyes meeting Thomas's in silent panic. But before either of the adults could react, Michael continued. I had a dream about Mommy, he said softly. She was smiling and said that you're just like her Aunt Mary? That you're sisters. Is that true? The room fell into complete silence for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Catherine looked at Thomas, a silent plea in her eyes. He nodded slightly, giving her permission to tell the truth. Yes, sweetheart, Catherine replied, her voice trembling. Your mom was my twin sister. I'm really your aunt. Michael stared at her for a long moment, his eyes, so much like Elizabeth's, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. I knew it, he said simply. You have the same smile as her. Michael's innocent words shattered something inside Catherine, and she began to cry silently. Thomas stepped closer to the bed, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The first true gesture of connection between them in all these years. Why are you crying, Aunt Mary? Don't you like being my real aunt? Catherine laughed through her tears. No, sweetheart. I'm crying because I'm happy. So happy to finally be able to say that I'm your aunt. And are you going to keep living with us? Michael asked, a touch of concern in his young voice. It was Thomas who answered, his voice firm and resolute. Yes, son. Your aunt is going to stay with us. We're a family. The words hung in the air of the hospital room, laden with promise and possibility. Catherine looked at Thomas with surprise and gratitude, while Michael smiled, satisfied with the answer. That night, as Michael drifted back to sleep, Thomas and Catherine stayed by his side, united not only by the memory of Elizabeth but by a new understanding of what it means to be family. Catherine's locket gleamed softly under the hospital's night light, no longer a symbol of secrets, but a reminder that sometimes love takes forms we never expect. The days that followed the hospital revelation brought subtle yet profound changes to the Armstrong mansion. The heavy air of secrets had dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of rediscovery and adjustment. Thomas watched with a mix of fascination and guilt as Catherine, still going by Mary to maintain discretion with the other staff, navigated her new position in the family. One particularly meaningful morning came when Thomas came down for breakfast and found Catherine packing her things in the small maid's room. What are you doing? He asked, stopping in the doorway. Catherine was carefully folding her work uniform. I think it's time to leave, she replied softly. Now that the truth has come out, it wouldn't be appropriate to stay here as a maid. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. And where would you go? I have some savings. I could rent an apartment nearby, keep seeing Michael regularly. Her voice faltered a bit as she mentioned her nephew. No, Thomas said with surprising firmness in his voice. This is your place. You're Michael's aunt, Elizabeth's sister. Your home is here. Catherine stopped folding the clothes, her hands trembling slightly. Thomas, it's not that simple. People will talk. "Let them talk," he replied, stepping into the room and sitting on the edge of the narrow bed. "I have a different proposal. The guest room upstairs next to Michael's, it should be yours now. And as for your job," he hesitated for a moment, "I'd like you to officially take over managing the house, not as a maid but as part of the family." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to do this." "I'm not doing it out of obligation," Thomas explained, surprised by his own sincerity. "For the last 3 years, you've kept this family together while I was too busy drowning in work and self-pity. It's time to fix that." In that moment, Michael appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his sleepy eyes widening when he saw the scene. "Aunt Mary, are you leaving?" His small voice was filled with fear. Catherine quickly wiped her tears. "No, sweetheart. Actually, your dad just invited me to move into the room next to yours." Michael's face lit up instantly. "Really, Dad?" Thomas nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest as he saw his son's joy. "Really? Your aunt is going to stay with us permanently now? Like a real family?" Michael asked, running to hug Catherine. "Yes, like a real family." Catherine's move to the upstairs room happened that very same day. Thomas watched, with a strange sense of déjà vu, as she arranged her belongings in the spacious guest room. It was the same room Elizabeth used to turn into her painting studio, and seeing Catherine there stirred a complex mix of emotions. "Elizabeth loved this room," Catherine said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "She would spend hours here, painting and dreaming." Thomas noticed a familiar object in her hands, a small, intricately carved wooden box he recognized as belonging to Elizabeth. "That's—" "Yes," Catherine confirmed, carefully opening the box. Inside were dozens of old photographs, some already yellowing with age. "Elizabeth kept all our memories here." She pulled out a particular photo, 2 identical little girls no older than 6, smiling at the camera in front of the orphanage. Their twin lockets gleamed in the sunlight. "It was taken the day we received the lockets," Catherine explained, her voice distant with the memory. "The social worker told us they had been left with us when we were babies. Elizabeth always believed that one day our mother would come back to get us." "And she never did?" Thomas asked gently. Catherine shook her head. "No. Years later, when we were already adults, we found out she had passed away shortly after leaving us at the orphanage. She was very young, scared. I think she did what she thought was best at the time." "How did you find out?" "Elizabeth hired a private investigator when she got sick." "She wanted answers before?" Catherine stopped, swallowing hard. "We found out our mother was just a teenager when she had us. She died in a car accident a few months after leaving us at the orphanage." Thomas picked up another photo from the box. This one showed Elizabeth and Catherine as adults, sitting at some cafe. It was dated just a few weeks before the accident. "This was our last meeting," Catherine said, gently touching the photo. "Elizabeth already knew about the cancer, but you'd never guess by her smile. She was like that, always thinking of others, always protecting those she loved." "Why didn't she ever tell me about the illness?" The question that had been haunting Thomas finally came out. Catherine sighed deeply. "Because she knew you'd try to do everything to save her, even when there was no hope left. She didn't want her last months to be about doctors and treatments. She wanted them to be about love, about making memories with you and Michael." The tears Thomas had been holding back began to fall. Catherine, hesitant, placed a hand on his shoulder, the first real physical contact between them. "She loved you so much, Thomas. And she loved Michael more than anything. That's why she planned all this, to make sure you two would never really be alone." At that moment, Michael burst into the room carrying his favorite photo album. "Look what I found, Aunt Mary. There are pictures of Mom here." Catherine smiled through her tears, pulling her nephew into her lap. "Do you want me to tell you stories about when your mom was little?" Michael nodded enthusiastically, snuggling between Catherine and Thomas. As she began telling stories about 2 identical girls who grew up together in the orphanage, Thomas watched, amazed as his son absorbed every word, his eyes shining with the discovery of this new chapter in his family's history. The afternoon passed like this, with the 3 of them sitting on the floor of the room, surrounded by photographs and memories. As Catherine shared story after story, Thomas felt the last walls in his heart crumble. There, between laughter and tears, a new version of family was taking shape, a version that honored the past while building a different future. Elizabeth had planned everything down to the last detail, to ensure that her love would live on through her twin sister. And now, at last, Thomas was beginning to understand the depth of that final gift she had left for all of them. 2 months had passed since Catherine's true identity was revealed, and the Armstrong mansion had gradually transformed. Mary's old maid's room remained empty, a silent reminder of the life she had lived for so long. Now, settled into the room next to Michael's, Catherine was starting to find her true place in the family. On a particularly sunny Saturday morning, Thomas was in his office when he heard excited voices coming from the garden. He approached the window and saw Catherine and Michael engaged in an activity that made his heart stop for a moment. They were painting. Catherine had set up 2 easels side by side, and both were working on their own canvases, just like Elizabeth used to do with her son. "Look, Aunt Cat," Michael said, using the affectionate nickname he had created for her for the first time, "I'm painting our family." Thomas looked at his son's painting. Colorful and simple figures represented himself, Michael, Catherine, and floating above them like an angel, Elizabeth. The child's drawing carried a truth so pure that it made his eyes sting. "It's beautiful, darling," Catherine replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Your mom would have loved this." She also loved painting families. The scene was so familiar and yet so new that Thomas felt the need to join them. Coming down the stairs, he paused for a moment at the door leading to the garden, watching the interaction between aunt and nephew. "Dad!" Michael exclaimed upon seeing him. "Come see what I painted." Thomas approached, noticing how Catherine tensed slightly. There were still moments of discomfort between them, times when the past seemed heavier than the present. "It's wonderful, son," he said, studying the drawing. Then, turning to Catherine, he added, "I didn't know you painted too." "Elizabeth taught me," she replied softly. "During the years we were apart, painting was a way for me to feel connected to her." Thomas looked at Catherine's canvas and felt his breath catch. She was painting a scene from the past, 2 identical girls sitting on a swing, their medallions shining in the sun. "I have something to show you both," Thomas said suddenly, making a decision he had been postponing for weeks. "Could you follow me to the office?" In the office, Thomas opened a safe embedded in the wall that Catherine had never noticed before. From inside he took out a leather folder and a small velvet box. "Elizabeth left this for you, Catherine," he explained, handing her the folder. I should have given it to you before, but I needed time to process everything." With trembling hands, Catherine opened the folder. Inside were legal documents and a letter addressed to her. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines and she gasped. "This is?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "Elizabeth left half of her inheritance to you. She also set up a trust for Michael that you'll manage with me." Catherine shook her head, stunned. "I can't accept this." "You can and you should," Thomas insisted. "But there's more." He opened the velvet box, revealing a 3rd medallion, identical to the ones the sisters had worn. Elizabeth had this made for Michael. She wanted him to have a physical connection to this story, to this legacy. Michael approached, fascinated by the golden medallion. "Can I wear it?" "Of course, son." Thomas placed the medallion around the boy's neck, and he immediately compared it to Catherine's. "Now we're really a family," Michael declared with the simple honesty of children. "We all have a piece of mommy with us." Michael's innocent words triggered something in Catherine. She began to cry quietly, holding her own medallion as if it were a lifeline. "Elizabeth always knew what she was doing," she said through her tears. "Even at the end she was thinking of all of us, planning how to keep us together." Thomas stepped closer to Catherine, making a decision that had been growing in his heart over the past few weeks. "There's one more thing I need to say." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I want you to legally take your place in this family. Not just as Michael's aunt, but as his co-guardian." Catherine looked at Thomas in shock. "What?" "It's what Elizabeth wanted," he explained, "and it's what Michael needs. It's what we all need. You're already a part of this family, Catherine. It's time to make it official." "But people will talk. Your reputation." "Let them talk," Thomas responded firmly. "I've spent too much time worrying about appearances and forgetting what really matters. Elizabeth taught me that in the hardest way possible. I won't make the same mistake twice." Michael, who had been listening quietly, hugged Catherine tightly. "Please, Aunt Cat, say yes. Then you'll never have to pretend to be someone else again." Catherine looked at her nephew, then at Thomas, and finally at the documents in her hands. Years of secrets, of suppressed pain, of love disguised, all culminating in this moment. "Yes," she whispered finally. "Yes, I accept." Thomas smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't shown in years. "Then it's decided. From today we're officially a family." At that moment, a ray of sunlight entered through the office window, making all 3 medallions shine simultaneously. It was as if Elizabeth were there, blessing this union she had so carefully planned. The transformation was complete. Thomas Armstrong, the man who once lived only for work and appearances, had finally understood the true meaning of family. and Catherine, who had spent years living in the shadows, could finally step into the light. Together they had found a new kind of happiness, not perfect, not without scars, but deeply true. It was exactly what Elizabeth had always wanted for the people she loved most in the world. A year had passed since that afternoon in the office. The Armstrong mansion, once a monument to solitude and secrets, had been transformed into a true home. The changes were evident not only in the lighter atmosphere of the house but also in the small things of everyday life. Catherine's former room, now turned into a painting studio, was always filled with light and color. The walls, once bare, now displayed works of art created by her and Michael. Some signed by both, others dedicated to Elizabeth's memory. It was a sacred space where aunt and nephew spent hours sharing not just painting techniques but also stories and memories. Thomas, for his part, had made significant changes in his professional life. For the first time in his career, he set clear boundaries between work and family. His evenings and weekends now belonged exclusively to Michael and Catherine. The powerful CEO had learned that some meetings could wait, but moments with family were irreplaceable. On a particularly meaningful Sunday morning, the three of them gathered in the garden for a ritual that had become tradition: the outdoor breakfast. The table was set beneath the old tree that Elizabeth had loved so much, and the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the fragrance of newly bloomed flowers. "Dad," Michael called as he nibbled on a piece of toast with jam, "can I show you the photo I found yesterday?" Thomas nodded, watching his son run into the house. Catherine smiled, knowing exactly which photo he was referring to. They had found it together while sorting through old boxes in the attic. Michael returned carrying a framed photograph that captured a precious moment. Elizabeth, pregnant, sitting in the same garden they were in now, with Catherine by her side. The sisters smiled at the camera, their twin medallions gleaming in the sunlight. "This was taken a week before you were born," Catherine explained softly. "Elizabeth was so happy that day, she already knew you were a boy and couldn't stop making plans." Thomas carefully took the photo, his fingers tracing the contours of Elizabeth's face. "She was radiant," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Exactly how I always remember her." "Aunt Cat," Michael asked, playing with his own medallion, "did Mom know that one day we'd be a family like this?" Catherine exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas before responding. "Your mom always knew exactly what she was doing, sweetheart. She planned all of this, not the specific details perhaps, but the most important part, that we'd stay united, taking care of each other. Like a puzzle," Michael reflected, with the surprising wisdom that children sometimes show. "Each of us is a piece and Mom helped us fit together." Thomas felt his heart tighten at his son's words. "Exactly, son. Your mom left us the greatest gift of all, each other." The sound of children's laughter drifted over to them. The neighbors' kids playing in their own garden. Catherine watched as Michael looked eagerly toward joining the fun. "Go ahead," she encouraged with a smile. "But don't forget we have that art exhibition later." Michael nodded enthusiastically before running to join the other children. The school's art exhibition was an important event. It would be the first time one of his paintings would be publicly displayed. The painting, a portrait of the family with Elizabeth as a guardian angel, had been chosen as the highlight of the exhibition. As they watched Michael run off, Thomas turned to Catherine. "You know you've changed our lives, don't you?" Catherine blushed slightly. "You've changed mine too. After Elizabeth passed, I thought I'd never have a real family again. Now." She touched her medallion, a gesture that had become more of a comfort than a hiding place. "Now I know she never really left us." "No, she didn't," Thomas agreed, his gaze drifting to the garden that Elizabeth had loved so much. "She's in every moment we share, in every laugh of Michael's, in every painting you two create together." A gentle breeze swept through the garden, making the leaves of the old tree dance, and the three medallions, Catherine's, Michael's as he played, and the one Thomas now carried in his pocket as a constant reminder, gleam in the sunlight. The Armstrong mansion was no longer just an imposing house full of empty spaces and unspoken secrets. It had transformed into a home where Elizabeth's love lived on through the people she had loved most, her son, her sister, and her husband. A place where the past was no longer a burden to carry, but a source of strength and unity. Thomas Armstrong, the man who once measured success only in numbers and professional achievements, had learned the most valuable lesson of all: that a person's true legacy isn't in the empire they build, but in the love they leave behind. And thanks to Elizabeth, that love had found a way to continue growing, changing, and transforming lives long after her passing. The quiet transformation that began with a fallen medallion had come to its end, but the Armstrong family story continued, no longer in secret, no longer in the shadows, but in the light of day, just as Elizabeth had always wished. And what about you? What did you think of this touching story? If it moved your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button to help us bring more stories like this to others, and make sure to subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Together, we can keep discovering and sharing stories that remind us of the true meaning of family and love. See you next time.